This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Khandam.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, in the aftermath of the Trump sweeping victory over Kamala Harris and the Democrats, the carnage, the destruction, and the devastation that Israel is bringing to Palestine and Lebanon continues unabated. Just last night, there was a massive bomb strike in the heart of Beirut and 100 missiles coming from Lebanon into Tel Aviv. Despite the U.S. efforts to broker a peace deal, we have skepticism about that. The war is ravaging in Lebanese, Palestinians in Gaza and beyond. We're going to be talking about that today. In addition to the ICC issuing arrest warrants, Jamal, finally, for Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant, will be kind of covering all of that in addition to the United States and their warmongering, not just in Palestine and Lebanon, Jamal, but also in the Ukraine. But before we get there, we're going to watch a really fantastic interview that you did with Saul Takahashi. He's a professor of human rights and peace studies in Osaka in Japan. And he's going to explain why he believes that Israel should be expelled from the United Nations. It's a very compelling interview, Jamal.
It is, and the timing couldn't have been any better, Jess. This is how it played. One day, the United States vetoes a resolution. I don't know what number resolution now for calling for a ceasefire. It's the only country out of 14 countries that said no. And the second day, the ICC issues, drops the legal bombshell and issues arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and ex-Defense Minister Yoav Gallant over war crimes in Gaza. But first, let's watch the interview with Professor Saul Takahashi. On November 20th, the United States vetoed yet another resolution calling for ceasefire in Gaza at the United Nations Security Council. However, the following day, some measure of justice was served by the International Criminal Court, which issued long-awaited arrest warrants for Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for alleged war crimes in Gaza. The result is that 124 signatory countries to the ICC statute are now obligated to arrest them within their territory. Joining us on Arab Talk is Saul Takahashi to discuss what Israel's continued impunity for its occupation, genocide, and apartheid in the Palestinian-occupied territories is a global threat to the rule of law and why the status quo must change. Mr. Takahashi is Professor of Human Rights and Peace Studies at Osaka Jogakuin University. From March 2009 to May 2014, he served as Deputy Head of Office at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Palestine. His recent article in Opinio Juris is entitled Rethinking International Law After Gaza Symposium, Israel Must Be Expelled from the United Nations. Welcome to Arab Talk, Saul.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start with the most recent news. The United States recently vetoed the most recent Gaza ceasefire resolution in the UN Security Council, underscoring that it had never supported a ceasefire as it had professed all along, and that it was acting on Israel's behalf to thwart real humanitarian relief for the Palestinians as well as the release of remaining Israeli hostages. What were your expectations from this resolution?
Well, I don't know. I think I was hearing a lot of things from people in New York as to whether there was a chance that the U.S. would abstain, thereby allowing the resolution to be adopted. Again, I was hearing various different things from different people at different stages, but I can't say I was that optimistic. I think the entire rest of the Security Council, in particular they're called the E10, the elected 10 members, were they did their best, their absolute best, bending over backwards to accommodate the kind of language that the United States was demanding. And yet it still wasn't enough. So I have to say, after a certain point, I was getting a little bit pessimistic, and I'm not really surprised. Like you rightly said, the U.S. has never really supported a ceasefire in the true sense of the word. It was very, very clear. They said it very clearly. They weren't interested in a permanent ceasefire. They only wanted, the shooting to be stopped while Hamas rolled over and, released all the hostages, as they call them. And then the shooting can start again. That was the whole idea. So, the notion that they had been working tirelessly for a ceasefire like Biden would have the American people believe, and a lot of the Democratic members of Congress as well, was exposed as a farce. It's not so surprising, but, disappointing nonetheless.
Israel has long history of violating and ignoring the UN Charter and United Nations security resolutions. This year, it has become hostile to the UN, even killing many of its employees working in Gaza and designating UNRWA as a terrorist organization. Elaborate on how damaging this is to the ideas and founding principles of the UN.
Well, Israel has for many years now been openly hostile to the UN and has lambasted it at every opportunity, calling it anti-Semitic and biased against Israel and all this, that, and the other. But yes, since last October, of course, it's got markedly worse in that Israel is now openly using military force to attack UNRWA facilities. Again, they've done this before, but every time they've done this up till now, at least when I was there in Palestine, they've at least made some semblance of an effort to make excuses and justify their attacks with regards to, the standards of laws of war. Now, this time around, they've barely even done that. They haven't even bothered, honestly speaking. They've just said that UNRWA is a supporter of Hamas and a supporter of terrorism, incites against Israel, et cetera, and they just go ahead and just do whatever they want. The last I checked, they had attacked UNRWA facilities over 400 and I believe it was 440 times or 450 times. They've already killed around 250 staff of UNRWA. On top of that, they've also passed legislation. They didn't designate UNRWA. They didn't go so far as to designate UNRWA as a terrorist organization. They were going to do that, but that language was softened in the parliamentary procedure. But the effect is not so different. Basically, they have cut off relations with UNRWA. They have barred any Israeli government official from having contact with UNRWA. So this basically makes it impossible for UNRWA to operate in what? Well, first of all, they have banned it from operating in what they say is Israeli sovereign territory, i.e., Jerusalem, despite the fact that, of course, East Jerusalem, under international law, is still occupied territory. It's part of the West Bank. So that's one thing. But they've also basically this law these two laws basically make it impossible for UNRWA to operate in the West Bank as well, because Israel completely controls the West Bank. Israel controls the borders going in and out of the West Bank. There's practically speaking, there's no way UNRWA can operate under these circumstances, and the Israelis have already contacted the UN saying that they are, basically revoking the agreement with the agency, and that they are, that they are basically, cutting off relations with the agency. At the same time, we should also remember that they're also openly attacking UN peacekeepers in Lebanon. And again, this is not, they're hiding this. They aren't even making excuses. Oh, whoops, we made a mistake. We pulled the trigger the wrong time. And we thought Hezbollah was there. We mistake. We're sorry. They're not bothering with this. I mean, they're just saying, look, you guys get out of the way, and we're going to attack your facilities if you don't do as we say. So all of this is it's just another very extreme. The examples are getting more and more extreme by the day, but it just is another way of we can see how Israel openly defies the authority of the UN. Not only is it a serial violator of international law in general and of the UN Charter, its obligations of the UN Charter specifically, Not only does it openly defy UN human rights investigations and UN human rights experts, as a general rule, none of whom are even allowed into Israel, and none of whom the Israelis even cooperate with. But they openly vying the authority of the UN, and so really the question has to be asked: does Israel still deserve to maintain a seat amongst the peace-loving nations of the UN? Certainly, I would argue no.
You propose working around the power imbalance in the UN that protects Israel using a similar tactic used to isolate South Africa during apartheid when it was also occupying Namibia. Talk about this and why it is relevant to Israel.
Yes, sure. Now, the UN Charter has a provision to expel states, but of course, the expulsion is decided upon in the General Assembly, which is one country, one vote. So all countries are equal. No country has a veto in the General Assembly. This is the true, at least on paper, it's the true democracy of the UN. But this can only be taken to the General Assembly on the basis of a recommendation from the Security Council. And of course, here is the problem, as we all know. The Security Council is made up of 15 states, 10 of which are elected on a rotating basis, but 5 remain permanent member states. And these are the 5 victorious countries of World War II. So the United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China. And, this is what the world looked like in 1945. It's not what the world looks like in 2025. So, this is a complete anachronism and basically locks in these countries into a privileged position of power, into which they can make sure that nothing that goes against what they believe is their interests gets passed on by the Security Council. So this is, as I think we all know, this has been the long-standing problem. The General Assembly can decide upon this, that, and the other in terms of, calling for sanctions against a rogue state and the like. But they can't decide on anything which is actually binding on UN member states. That is the prerogative of the Security Council. That is to say, they can't decide on enforcement action. So, for example, if the International Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice has decided that Israel is plausibly committing genocide, and they are, looking at the case, and it will take a few more years, but already at this point, they're saying, look, there's a very plausible case here that Israel is committing genocide, and that is a binding finding on Israel. And they ordered Israel to do various different things. First and foremost, to stop any military operations which might amount to genocide, and also to allow adequate humanitarian aid into Gaza. And of course, Israel has openly ignored both of those. So those are legally binding decisions. However, they can't be enforced. I mean, the ICJ, none of these international bodies has like an army or a police force that goes around and, force states to live up to their obligations. It's only the Security Council that can decide this. And that's why the Security Council has this privileged, powerful position in the UN hierarchy. So getting back to what we were talking about, so the only way that a state can formally be expelled from the UN is if the Security Council goes for it, if they adopt this policy. Now, in South Africa, the only time that this has ever really been discussed in a serious way was during apartheid South Africa. This was the late 1960s, early 1970s. South Africa had been found also by the International Court of Justice to be illegally occupying Namibia. South Africa, obviously, as we all know, maintained a system of apartheid, which was increasingly subject to huge criticism by members of the international community. And so it was basically a rogue state, and there were resolution after resolution condemning South African practices, but they just did what Israel is doing, arguably to a lesser degree, but the same kind of thing. They were just thumbing their nose at the international community and saying, we're just going to do what we want and you can't stop us. So this finally was brought in 1974 to the Security Council. Unsurprisingly, the Western powers in the Security Council, so the US, the UK, and France, they vetoed the expulsion of South Africa. So here again, we see a very, very similar kind of situation where we have the Western quote unquote old imperialist powers basically protecting their protege in what they felt was a strategically important region. So they vetoed that. So then, we have the General Assembly and we have the rest of the world looking on this in disbelief and saying, what are we going to do? What the General Assembly did is they found a workaround to maneuver around the Security Council veto. So before the General Assembly starts, the General Assembly, again, is every member state of the United Nations comes to the General Assembly, which means they send, the capitals send a delegation to New York. And so the delegations show up and they basically have a piece of paper from their capital saying, these are the names of our delegation. And, we certify that these people are here representing our country. And we ask you to afford them all the privileges and immunities, that you require. And so they bring this piece of paper before the General Assembly starts. Now, the General Assembly has what's called the Credentials Committee. This is made up of the member states. It's not the civil service that does this. It's the member states. And they basically look at this piece of paper and they basically rubber stamp it. And they say, okay, we can see these are your names that we see. It's good to see you again. We saw you last year. And okay, we'll see you tomorrow. That's essentially how it works. And in most cases, it has been, of course, just a mechanical thing. Though not in all cases, it has happened before that, political factors came into play. So what the General Assembly said is they basically said, look, we're just not going to accept the credentials of the South African delegation anymore. You are an apartheid state. You are illegally occupying another state, and you are thumbing your nose at your international obligations under the UN Charter. So we're just not going to let you come. We're not going to recognize this as a legitimate, delegation. So that's basically what they did. And they made this decision in 1974, and it was ratified by vote in the General Assembly, of course, overwhelmingly accepted. And so basically the decision was, we are no longer accepting the credentials of South Africa until further notice, basically. And so this lasted 20 years until South Africa dismantled apartheid and was once again, accepted accepted into the General Assembly. So this is, all the similarities between South Africa and Israel, of course, are, there are obvious similarities. And I think this is something which can be done. It seems that there is a lot of interest amongst many member states to push this forward. A resolution was adopted, after the International Court of Justice in July, after they issued an opinion basically saying that the Israeli occupation of the 67 Palestinian territories was illegal and that Israel had to leave as soon as possible. The General Assembly adopted a resolution saying, okay, within 12 months, Israel, you have to leave. Also, all the rest of the world should levy sanctions against Israel. And there's specific language in this resolution basically saying we are very unhappy with the persistent defiance of the authority of the UN that Israel keeps on exhibiting. And this is the kind of language that was used in South African case as well. So, again, this is also an indication that, look, we're putting you on notice that if things don't improve markedly in a very dramatically short period of time, then, this is what could happen. So that the South African formula could be used again. And I know that there is, very serious movement towards you doing this in the General Assembly.
So you feel this it has a high possibility to kind of replicate what happened with South Africa?
I think there's a very, very real possibility that this could happen. Yes, I do. And I certainly hope it does, because besides the fact that the UN exists, first and foremost, to uphold international law, it has to maintain its integrity as an organization. I can't think of a better word, but it's an organization. There are rules that all the member states have to abide by. The UN has, of course, taken great pride in being a universal organization and trying to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table, so that at least we can talk things out, and that at least we can have these kind of peaceful discussions instead of shooting at each other. That's the whole idea of the UN. And I would say that in most cases it's worked pretty well. But when you have this rogue state that doesn't even pretend to abide by its obligations, that doesn't even pretend that it feels obligated to act in a proper way in accordance with how member states should act. I really think, the UN has to get together and say, look, we can't have this country as a member of the club if this is how they're going to act. And, what South Africa, being basically de facto suspended from the General Assembly in 1974, it took 20 years, of course, for them to dismantle apartheid, but that very stark international isolation was definitely one of the big elements that pushed them towards dismantling of apartheid. And I really think, that's what we have to replicate in the case of Israel.
Were you surprised and heartened that the day after the disappointing veto of the ceasefire, the International Criminal Court, not affiliated, of course, with the UN, issued its arrest warrants for Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant? What do you think is most significant about it?
You mean significant about the arrest warrants having been issued?
Yeah.
It is somewhat, it's, of course, we don't believe in coincidences, but it is somewhat of a coincidence and an amazing one that it happened the next day. Of course, you feel really, really down, and then the next day something good happens. The arrest warrants, of course, are very, very belated. This should have happened a year ago. Frankly, serious action should have been taken years ago. And then maybe we would not have been witnessing this horrendous genocide that is taking place in Gaza. But that shouldn't detract from the fact that this is a monumental step. This is a monumental step towards holding Israel accountable for its international crimes. And, it's just another element of this, another element in making sure that, basically bringing an end to Israeli impunity, to the impunity that they have enjoyed for decades, and which they clearly, expect will continue. If you look at the statements and of the actions of Israeli leaders, political leaders, military leaders, they clearly have no sense that they're ever going to be held to account, and this sense of impunity, it basically trickles down to the lowest ranking of soldiers, whom we have seen throughout this genocide. Are filming, using their phones, filming themselves, laughing, and while they're torturing Palestinians and committing other atrocities, and posting these on social media. I've never worked as a prosecutor, but I think the prosecutors of a lot of courts, including the ICC, are just they can't believe their luck with all this material that's been going on. So, all this is just another element towards bringing an end to that impunity. And that's really the core of it here. Israel has enjoyed impunity, like the Palestinian representatives said, I think this was at the Security Council the other day, as if basically, is there one international law for the rest of the world and another international law for Israel? Are there rules and norms for the rest of the world? But Israel, they don't apply to Israel. Is this what's going on here? That's really been the situation. And so that is, I really do believe strongly, this is finally coming to an end, and that is going to be very monumental. So the ICC arrest warrants are by themselves a very monumental and significant step, but as an element of this bigger picture, they are very, very important.
The ICC also issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, pretty much within a comparable span of time. How disingenuous is it for the United States and its Western allies to cheerlead the same prosecution for Putin that they condemn for Netanyahu and Gallant?
Well, the hypocrisy of these clowns that pass for leaders in the United States, just it beggars belief. The other day, after these warrants were issued, I think it was Lindsey Graham, writing something on his Twitter account, and I saw, somebody had, copied and pasted or taken a screenshot from his statement on Twitter from when the arrest warrant was issued for Putin, right next to the one, his statement right after the arrest warrant was issued for the Israeli leaders, and you can see the double standards, and it really is it's sickening, frankly. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. Obviously, the rest of the world is watching this, and with disgust. In 2016, when Trump was elected and he became president in 2017, and one of the things I remember him saying many times was, the rest of the world is laughing at us. And that one of the few things he got right. Yeah, that's true. The rest of the world is laughing at it, at the United States, or at least at the political leadership in the United States. But it's not funny. These double standards are really ridiculous, and they are being pointed out openly more and more by governments of other countries as well. And it is just another. It's just another factor in the U.S. losing its international leadership and losing its standing in the international community.
In terms of ancillary influence, do these arrest warrants by the ICC bolster support for countries to withhold weapons for Israel, or add corroborating evidence for cases in the International Court of Justice? Do you think there can be a valuable collaboration between the ICC and the United Nations, including the International Court of Justice, its legal arm?
Yes, of course. I mean, there is there can be cooperation between the UN and the ICJ and the ICC. They are, like you mentioned, the ICC and the ICJ and the UN. These are all different bodies, and there have to be. I think they respect each other's different mandates and different roles in the entire process. But for sure, if you look, for example, at the ICJ's findings up till now, certainly, they quote heavily from the findings of the UN Human Rights Agency, from UNRWA, from WHO, and from all these other UN agencies that have done such tireless work documenting Israeli human rights violations and other kind of atrocities. Obviously, the arrest warrants themselves we can't see, but human rights organizations and have been feeding the ICC information for years, for donkey's years, really. And the delay in having issued these arrest warrants, the delay also in even starting a proper investigation into Israeli crimes by the ICC, that has been a source of great frustration for the human rights community at large, for years. So this kind of information is, of course, this kind of information is open, it's public, and it's being provided to all of these bodies. And these bodies, they do take it seriously. They do look at it, and it's really heartening to see that finally, again, very belated, the ICC has not indicted Israeli leaders on genocide, which I think they should. But so it is not perfect. But so it is something. It is a very monumental step, and it's one which certainly would not have been taken if it weren't for the tireless pressure, or I wouldn't say pressure, but tireless feeding of information and tireless expressions of concern by human rights actors. It really is. It's about time.
You propose rethinking international law. Is the system as it now stands well conceived, but poorly implemented? Can you give two suggestions that would improve our system of international law?
Well, one thing that definitely has to happen is the Security Council has to be reformed. I mean, there's no question about that. I don't think anybody on earth thinks that the Security Council that it is just and proper how the Security Council is right now, except for senior political leaders and senior civil servants in the five governments in the governments of the five permanent members. They're the only ones who think we've got it made. Nobody in their right minds anywhere else in the world thinks that this is a good system. So that definitely has to change. There was movement towards this, which was quite a long time ago, around 2007, 2008, I think it was. And there was a chance. It looked like Japan might become a permanent member state, and maybe some other countries and all this, but there was always the question of whether they would get the veto. And due to various different sort of geopolitical factors, the whole thing just fell apart. I don't think anybody wants to reopen that again. But, without doing this, there is no way that the UN can remain really relevant. I mean, already, I think we spend a lot of attention looking at the UN. I mean, this has been pretty much my career, but the fact of the matter is, a lot of countries are moving away from looking at the UN as the sole forum for discussing and deciding on international issues. BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I believe it's called, these kind of other organizations, the OIC, of course, these kind of organizations are more and more gaining relevance and more, coming to the center in the role that they're playing. And that's just going to continue. I don't think the UN is going to go out of business, at least not anytime soon. But I think it's just going to be one of many different fora that countries are going to be using. The other thing about international law, of course, and this is a bit more of a bit more of a fundamental issue, but international law has a long history. International law was basically created by European powers to regulate relations between states. But the catch here rather, is that states only included basically the quote unquote civilized states of Europe. So anybody outside of Europe, the uncivilized savages, they didn't count. And international law was used very heavily as a tool by these European powers to further their colonialism and further European imperialism of the world. It justified a lot of approaches, a lot of colonialist approaches that these powers use. Like, for example, when Columbus arrived in North America, he said this was new virgin land, which nobody occupies, and it's ours for the taking. This is how not just Columbus, but all the Europeans, what they were saying when they came to the American continent, both North and South. Of course, the millions and millions of indigenous people, they didn't count. So, they were massacred, and that was the end of it. And the thing, this kind of attitude, continued on until very, very recently. And we see this it is still there very clearly in the case of Palestine. The Zionists, the early Zionists, when they went around to the European powers and basically convinced them to support their taking over of Palestine on the basis that they were going to be a forward base of imperialist power in this very vital region. And the savages, they didn't count. They were just savages. I mean, they weren't, they didn't have real title to the land. They didn't own the land. They didn't have, what President Wilson tried to advance as self-determination. They don't, self-determination, that's for, white Europeans in Eastern Europe. That's not for these people. That's not for these people. And so, these kind of attitudes, still very much linger on in the case of Palestine. And indeed, the chief prosecutor, the ICC, after he issued his request for the arrest warrants, I'm sure you must have seen this. He said that he had been approached at a certain point in the process, I think before his arrest warrants request, by what he called, I think, somebody he called a very, very, very senior Western official. And I've seen reports that it was probably Blinken, telling him, look, the International Criminal Court, it's not for Israel. This is for Africans or, thugs like Putin. It's not for Israel. So, these kind of attitudes still linger on. This is not something you'll really find in the text of international law or in the actual legal norms. And of course, it's developed in a different direction now, mainly because the over half of humanity that was still under European rule in 1947, when the partition resolution was adopted in the UNGA, and 1948, when, of course, Israel declared itself a state, and 1949, when Israel was accepted in the UN. It's a completely different UN than it was now. It was a completely different ballgame than it was now. So international law in many ways has developed in a different direction. So you won't see that in the kind of text, but it's the attitude and it's these structures which still remain very beholden to Western interests. One sort of specific concrete thing that I just might say just to close this is that one of the big problems that the UN faces is financial instability. People often it's it's taken up in the media about how the United States is not going to pay its dues anymore, and this is often used as a hostage and this kind of thing. Every member state has to pay a certain amount of money for the upkeep of the UN, and there's a formula for this, and it's how much of the world's global GDP that country has. But this is actually a very, very small amount. And this money goes to the UN, and it's all decided in the GA how it's to be decided, and it's not so significant. It's not like it's a huge amount, but it's not like it's it's not the majority. It's not the bulk of the UN budget. It's very difficult to calculate exactly how much it is, but it's probably around 1/10, if even. Most of the rest of the UN, and certainly the humanitarian agencies and human rights, agencies doing human rights stuff, they're heavily dependent on what are called voluntary contributions. Basically means that the agency goes around to countries and say, we want to do this, we want to do that, but we don't have the money. So they go around with a tin can and say, could you please, donate? And we saw that like with UNRWA. UNRWA was, I think it was 93 or over 90% of it was voluntary contributions. That's why it was so vulnerable. That's why states could just cut off a spigot, at a moment's notice, and immediately they were at risk of collapse. So, what's important to note here is that, the UN, when I'm speaking as a former UN civil servant, when we go around, with a tin cup in our hands, we don't go to, Bangladesh or Sierra Leone or Cambodia. Obviously, we go to the United States and Germany and the Netherlands and Denmark and Japan, whatever. These are the states we go to because these are the states we can sort of expect would give us money. And, not to sort of criticize those specific states in a specific instance, but everybody understands that the people giving the money, they have a say in how the money is spent. So, they and I have been in these meetings where we would present them with a project, and a donor government would say, well, we're interested in funding you, but maybe you want to go a little bit soft on this part. Maybe the criticism of, this member state, that's not really what we want. Maybe you want to sort of take that out of it, then we'll fund it. That's how these things happen. And, and there's also, of course, because we understand that as the civil service, we would go to these meetings, we would create these project proposals with the priorities of each member state in mind. Basically, what I'm saying is we're not going to go to USAID and say, we want to do this project documenting the atrocities of the Israelis, and we're going to do public advocacy against Israeli genocide. It's not going to happen. We're not going to do it because it's going to be a waste of our money. We're just not going to do it. So, this kind of, it's not so much the law as such, but it's the instability and the vulnerability of these international structures that really has to change. Otherwise, the Western powers are going to continue dominating. The rich are going to get their way. The rich and powerful are going to get their way. And that really is what has to change, I think.
Saul Takahashi, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, that's the voice and the face of Professor Saul Takahashi, professor of human rights and peace studies in Osaka, Japan, making clearly, Jamal, a very compelling argument for why Israel needs to be condemned and basically removed from the United Nations. It's a great analysis. And, maybe people will listen to Professor Takahashi because Israel continues to flaunt international law at every stage, at every level. They continue to act with impunity with the support of the United States. Are people listening to Professor Takahashi?
Well, I think the rest of the world, because you're talking about, any resolution that comes through, it's mostly more than 120 countries support it. And on one side, and then you got basically the United States and Israel and a couple of others. But recently, even, it's just the United States and Israel. And Israel has been thumbing its nose on resolution after resolution and so forth, because the United States has its back and therefore the United Nations is helpless to enforce any of its resolutions. I mean, it's either you have the United Nations or you just basically remove Israel, or, in my opinion, cancel the United Nations.
Yeah, but that's part of the strategy of the Trump administration is to cancel and get rid of the United Nations. I mean, the United Nations, especially when it comes to what's happening in Palestine, has become completely useless because of the United States. And even though the ICC has issued these arrest warrants, and we'll get into this, obviously, we heard a very kind of interesting analysis from the Biden administration, as well as from the State Department. And check this out, Jamal. The leader of the free world, the so-called leader of the free world, the United States, what did they do? They condemned international law. They condemn the ICC arrest warrants. They said they reject the arrest warrants. I mean, the hypocrisy is just dripping throughout the Democratic executive branch, the Biden administration, the State Department, and they're still confused, Jamal, about why they lost the election.
Well, the message from the ICC is very clear, and it states that each, meaning Netanyahu and Gallant, bear criminal responsibility for the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare and the crimes against humanity of murder, persecution, and other inhumane acts, as well as intentionally directing an attack against the civilian population. I mean, if we're not going to respect a statement like this, which applies to every single war, basically, again, it's like the rule of law out of the window because of Israel. When it comes to Israel, the United States and few other countries want to have that exception rule that it doesn't apply to Israel. And then, of course, the Israelis can cry like Netanyahu immediately starts attacking the ICC, calling it anti-Semitic and so forth. But theoretically, let's say theoretically, the ICC warrant means that Netanyahu and Gallant could be arrested if they traveled to any of the more than 120 countries that are parties to the court. So good luck to them. Let them take their chance. I mean, we can see the writing on the wall, and then but then again, these countries have to justify why they are not doing that. Like we can go country by country if you want, just some of them that made statements.
Right.
But some of them.
But the EU, Jamal, it's important that the EU in Belgium, their central committee and leaders in EU said basically they will respect the ruling of the ICC. And then France, Spain, and some other countries obviously made strong statements that they will honor the ICC ruling. So, honoring the ruling doesn't say as strongly, we will arrest Netanyahu and Gallant if they come here. The other interesting thing about the ICC ruling, Jamal, it doesn't rule out additional arrest warrants coming out for Israeli soldiers and other military personnel who actively participated in these war crimes too. So I think Israelis who participated in the genocide are in for a rude awakening. They may only be able to travel to the United States, Jamal, given this ICC ruling.
100%, Jess. It's only the tip of the iceberg. Imagine all the hundreds of Israeli soldiers bragging about their war crimes on TikTok, Facebook, and other social media outlets. I mean, it's a gift from heaven to any prosecutor, right? I mean, it's a dream for any prosecutor to have video evidence. Imagine a criminal, a murderer, killing somebody and then putting it on video and say, here I am, look at me, I'm killing this person. I mean, it's a gift. And that's what they've been doing. So, and we've spoke about this. There is an organization that has been collecting this video evidence and documenting it, and they're just going to present it, and they have to act. So, those are the top people, the prime minister and the defense minister. You have colonels, you have generals, you have, lieutenants, you have average soldiers who have been committing war crimes. They can spend, basically the ICC can spend months, basically, if not years, prosecuting them if they want to pursue it.
Yeah, Jamal, and I think, the groups that are doing this, one of the more important ones that has been, writing quite a bit about this is the Hind Rajab Foundation. We spoke with one of the executives of that organization in a previous episode, and they are doing excellent, excellent work in kind of collecting all of this evidence. And I agree with you 100%. It's a prosecutor's dream to have all these video confessions live, some broadcast live, but all recorded on various forms of social media. There seems to be no kind of hesitation by the Israeli military whatsoever and its members to advertise that they're committing war crimes. So we can anticipate, Jamal, that the ICC process will continue for a long time in cataloging and then holding accountable Israelis. But my question to you, Jamal, and this is kind of taking it to the next step, next level, if you will the ICC have enough backbone to also issue arrest warrants for Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, and Kamala Harris? Because the complicity involved in sending weapons, even though knowingly they knew these weapons would kill civilians and starve civilians and kill children, will the ICC be able to take the next step?
Very tough question to answer, Jess. But the writing is on the wall, and actually we can take a hint from what Senator Lindsey Graham had recently said, he was threatening France and England and other close allies of the United States, saying that if they implement the ICC warrant and arrest Netanyahu and Gallant and so forth, that he will try to push a resolution to basically destroy them economically. I mean, that's his, I'm paraphrasing his words.
Oh, you know what he said directly?
And then he said, because if it goes through, then the ICC could come after us. So that's the hint, that's the worry, meaning after the United States. And
in fact, I'm sorry to interrupt, but in fact, Lindsey Graham said, we will crush you. Here's a senator telling sovereign countries of Europe, France, Spain, Italy. I don't know if Italy made the statement.
Close ally, we have to say, the closest of allies,
He said that we will crush you. Can you imagine a sitting senator saying to our closest allies, we will crush you? So this tells you what we're in store for, Jamal. And I just want to go back to a point that you made, which is really important. It's either we either live by international law or we don't. It's a very simple analysis. We either have it or we don't. And if we have it, we have to push through on these prosecutions, right? And if we don't, get rid of the UN, get rid of the ICC, get rid of the ICJ.
We cannot continue with this Israel exceptionalism for basically Israel. Look, Germany, Belgium, Ireland, Spain made it very clear. Netherlands, they all issued statements when they said, if Gallant and Netanyahu set foot on their soil, they'll be arrested. Imagine Germany saying, which by the way, this whole International Court of Justice was created because of Germany, because of its Holocaust. Right. And they said, well, we respect, we are signatories to the ICC and we respect that. However, because of the Holocaust, we have different relationship with Israel. So just because they had a Holocaust, they're going to allow them to commit a genocide. It makes your head turn, Jess, the way, the way they're explaining it, and others. But you got countries like the UK, for example. They said they respect it. They'll respect what the ICC ruling, and not forget about all these countries, including the United States, the positions they've taken when Putin was when a warrant was issued for Putin, and they were all in support of that. So look at the hypocrisy again.
Well, just to add the insult to injury, Jamal, one leader came out besides Biden and Blinken, one European leader did come out with full-throated support for Benjamin Netanyahu, saying, Benjamin Netanyahu can come to my country, my capital, anytime, and he will be welcomed. And who is that? It's Viktor Orban,
Hungary.
the autocrat, the dictator from Hungary, who is killed and imprisoned and basically has a police state right now and is universally reviled within the EU as well as globally. I mean, he's been described as at best an autocrat and a dictator, is saying that he's going to open his arms to Benjamin Netanyahu. So I guess what's the old saying? Birds of a feather flock together. So you have Joe Biden and Viktor Orban, interesting kind of bedfellows, and then you have the rest of the world saying Netanyahu and Gallant should be arrested.
So we have less than 2 months for the Biden-Harris administration, Jess. And you'll think that they'll be taking care of business, trying to hand over, the White House and so forth. And things usually slow down. The last 2 months, it's all basically administrations just go about, I would say...
Caretaking, right?
Caretaking. He authorizes Ukraine to use long-range U.S. weapons in Russia. I mean, he doesn't want to let go. Few days later, Russia attacks Ukraine with a new intermediate ballistic missile. Okay, so he pushes Putin, to a corner to basically to respond. And of course, our Senate, at the behest of Biden, an encouragement, they kill a resolution by Senator Bernie Sanders, basically to withhold weapons to Israel, because Israel has not adhered to what the Biden administration has instructed it to do. 30 days, if you don't allow food and medicine, etc., to enter there, we are going to withhold weapons.
Right.
How do you explain this?
Well, it's pretty easy to explain, Jamal, honestly, is that, we've been saying for years now that the Biden-Harris Blinken administration, despite being so-called Democrats, has been full-throated in their support for war, has been a war machine, has amplified and sold more weapons and given more weapons to Ukraine and Israel, has created more fragmentation and more instability in the world than probably any other administration in recent memory. Isn't it ironic, Jamal, that Biden and Harris and Blinken have created more instability globally than Trump did when he was president, the last time? I mean, I'm not even going to question Biden's intellectual cognitive abilities. This is what he believes. And if he thinks Putin is going to back down, and if Ukraine really starts using, as they have more extensively, these long-range weapons, and given what's happening in Lebanon right now, Jamal, that Israel bombed central Beirut again in the last 24 hours. Things are getting worse. By the way, this is the American peace plan. We're creating peace. And what happens every time the Americans do their peace negotiations? Blinken does this. There's more instability. There's more war. There's more destruction by Israel. So my question back to you, how do I explain it? Well, this is the Biden policy. My question back to you is, what are the Democrats selling, Jamal? What are the progressive liberal Democrats selling that Biden in his last 2 months, and Harris, given, they got slapped down in the election, it seems like they want to create more instability coming into the Trump administration.
Well, also they wonder why they've lost. They try to make all these excuses, right, and not talk about their war-mongering effort and what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Lebanon, the war in Ukraine. They just want to talk about anything but this. I mean, imagine, okay, so part of Harris's campaign, let's remind our viewers and listeners, when she was getting pushed to talk about the ceasefire, she said, yeah, we're fighting to get the ceasefire and releasing the hostages. They don't talk about this. So imagine at the UN Security Council, despite having secured 14 votes in favor for a draft resolution, which was put forward by the 10 elected members of the Security Council, there are the permanent and those are the elected, the E10 they call them. They failed to pass basically the ceasefire that Harris has been marketing during her campaign.
Right.
So what does this tell you? It tells you that she was lying to the American public. She was lying. She was like making these promises, vote for me, I'm going to bring peace and stability into the Middle East. Well, you have your chance. You have 2 months. In 2 months, and I said there's only 2 months. In 2 months, I don't want to put a figure, but thousands of people could die. They couldn't care less. They couldn't care less.
They don't care, Jamal. Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Antony Blinken, and this cabal, because they are a cabal, have not only lied to the American public, not only have created more instability, more unsafety in the world, have been just fomenting this kind of destruction of I call it, Jamal, a destruction of the world order. The world order says there are certain rules that we ought to live by as a world community so that we can function globally. And this came out of World War II. The United Nations came out of it, the Nuremberg trials, the ICC, the ICJ, international human rights. All of this came after World War II because we knew that we had to have some guardrails, right, around, these aggressive tendencies. But who is it now that's turning into the most aggressive, most depraved, most warmongering country on the planet right now? You might say it's Russia. I don't know if it is Russia now, Jamal. If you look at the United States and the Israel coalition, their complicity, what they've done, what they're doing in Palestine, what they're doing in Lebanon, what they're doing in Yemen, what they're doing in Syria, what they're doing globally. Is it fair to say that Russia is creating the most instability now? I'm not sure you can make that statement anymore, Jamal.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.